What if I told you that beneath the waves of our oceans lies the greatest mystery humanity has ever tried to solve? A civilization so advanced, so perfect, that its very existence challenges everything we think we know about ancient history. Tonight, we're diving deep into the lost city of Atlantis, but not in the way you've heard before. Because here's what nobody talks about. While archaeologists spend decades digging through sand and scholars debate over ancient texts, there's a darker truth hiding in plain sight. The story of Atlantis isn't just about a sunken city. It's about knowledge so dangerous that entire civilizations have spent thousands of years trying to bury it. And the deeper we dig, the more we realize that maybe, just maybe, they succeeded. Welcome to Bedtime History, where the past whispers its secrets to those brave enough to listen. I'm your guide through the shadows of time, and tonight we're going to uncover something that will change the way you see ancient history forever. Because what you're about to discover isn't just the story of Atlantis. It's the story of why some truths are meant to stay hidden. Most people think Atlantis began with Plato. They're wrong. The legend is older, darker, and more complex than anything you learned in school. And by the end of this journey, you'll understand why certain people have worked so hard to make sure you never learned the real story. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me take you back to a time when the line between myth and reality didn't exist, because sometimes the most dangerous truths are the ones we dismiss as fairy tales. The year is 360 BCE, and in the marble halls of Athens, an aging philosopher named Plato sits down to write what he believes will be his masterpiece. But as he dips his stylus into ink and begins to craft the tale of a perfect civilization destroyed by its own hubris, he has no idea that he's about to unleash a mystery that will consume human imagination for over 2 millennia. Or does he? You see, here's where the story gets interesting. Plato wasn't just telling a story, he was revealing something. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he doesn't present Atlantis as fiction. He presents it as historical fact, passed down through generations from the great lawgiver Solon, who learned it from Egyptian priests in the sacred city of Sais. Picture this scene. Solon, the wisest man in Athens, stands in the temple of Neith, surrounded by hieroglyphic, covered walls that stretch into shadowy darkness. An elderly priest, keeper of records spanning thousands of years, looks at this Greek visitor with something approaching pity. "You Greeks are children," the priest says, his voice echoing off ancient stones. "You know nothing of the deep past. You know nothing of the great civilization that once ruled the Western Ocean." And then he tells Solon a story that will haunt the world forever. 9,000 years before Plato's time, beyond the Pillars of Hercules where the Mediterranean opens into the vast Atlantic, there existed an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. This wasn't just any island, this was Atlantis, the crown jewel of a maritime empire that stretched across the known world. But here's what sends chills down the spine of anyone who really studies this account. The priest doesn't describe Atlantis as a simple island kingdom. He describes a civilization that possessed technology and knowledge that shouldn't have existed. They had mastered metallurgy in ways that produced mysterious alloys. They had built harbors with engineering that defied the physics of their time. They had developed a form of crystal technology that powered their entire society. Most unsettling of all, they had achieved something that every civilization since has desperately sought. They had conquered death itself. The Atlanteans, according to these ancient records, lived for hundreds of years. Their kings ruled for centuries. Their wise men accumulated knowledge across lifespans that dwarfed ordinary human existence. And in their temples, they practiced rituals that connected them directly to forces beyond the physical world. This wasn't primitive mythology. This was advanced science disguised as legend. Think about it. What if the real reason Atlantis has captivated us for so long isn't because it's a beautiful myth? What if it's because some part of our collective unconscious remembers that it was real? What if buried deep in human genetic memory, lies the echo of a time when we were more than we are now. The Egyptian priest's account grows darker as it continues. He tells Solon that the Atlanteans began as a noble people, chosen by Poseidon himself and blessed with divine knowledge. Their capital city was a marvel of engineering, concentric circles of land and water, connected by bridges and tunnels, protected by walls that gleamed with precious metals. At the center stood a temple to Poseidon, covered in silver except for the pinnacles which were gold. Inside stood a massive statue of the god driving 6 winged horses, so tall it touched the temple roof. Around it were golden statues of the original 10 kings of Atlantis, and the wives who had borne them children. But power corrupts, even the divine. As generations passed, the Atlanteans began to lose their connection to the gods. They grew arrogant, they became greedy, they started to believe they were gods themselves. And that's when they made their fatal mistake. They decided to conquer the world. Ancient Athens, at the height of its glory, stood alone against the Atlantean invasion. While the rest of the Mediterranean cowered before the advanced weapons and superior numbers of the island empire, the Athenians fought with the desperate courage of the doomed. But then, in a single day and night, everything changed. The gods, disgusted by Atlantean hubris, sent earthquakes and floods of unprecedented violence. The entire island continent, with all its millions of inhabitants, its impossible architecture, its accumulated wisdom of millennia, sank beneath the waves and disappeared forever. Or so the story goes. Here's what makes this account truly chilling. The Egyptian priest tells Solon that this cataclysm created a sea of mud that made the Western Ocean unnavigable for generations afterward. Ships couldn't cross the Atlantic because the sunken continent had created underwater barriers and treacherous shallows. This detail matters because it explains why, for thousands of years, no one could verify or disprove the story. The evidence was literally underwater, protected by natural barriers that prevented exploration. But was it really natural? Modern researchers have discovered something disturbing about Plato's account. The level of detail he provides about Atlantean society, their laws, their architecture, their military organization, goes far beyond what you'd expect from a philosophical allegory. He describes their governmental structure with the precision of a constitutional scholar. He outlines their economic system with the detail of a trained economist. He maps their city with the accuracy of an architect. Most telling of all, he provides specific measurements. The central plain of Atlantis was 3,000 stadia long by 2,000 stadia wide. The city's outer ring of water was 3 stadia wide. The bridges connecting the rings were exactly 100 feet wide. This isn't the language of myth. This is the language of historical record. So, either Plato was the most gifted fictional world builder in human history, creating a fantasy civilization with documentary precision for reasons scholars still can't explain, or he was recording something he genuinely believed to be true. And if he believed it was true, that means the Egyptian priests believed it was true, which means their records, stretching back thousands of years, contained accounts of a real civilization that possessed advanced technology, lived impossibly long lives, and sank beneath the ocean in a single catastrophic day. A civilization whose knowledge and power were so dangerous that the gods themselves had to destroy it. But here's the question that keeps researchers awake at night. If Atlantis was real, and if it possessed technology and knowledge beyond anything we've achieved today, then what happened to that knowledge when the island sank? Did it disappear forever beneath the waves? Or did some of it survive, hidden in places and ways we're only beginning to understand? Because if you start looking at certain ancient sites around the world with fresh eyes, if you examine certain artifacts that don't fit the accepted timeline of human development, if you pay attention to certain knowledge that appears in cultures that supposedly never had contact with each other, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. A pattern that suggests the fall of Atlantis wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. The pattern starts with the pyramids, but not in the way you think. Everyone knows about the Great Pyramid of Giza, but what most people don't realize is that pyramid construction appears simultaneously across the globe in cultures that had absolutely no contact with each other. Egypt, Mexico, Peru, China, Cambodia, Indonesia, all building massive stone structures using techniques that modern engineers still can't fully explain. But it gets stranger. The mathematical proportions embedded in these structures reveal knowledge of advanced geometry, astronomy, and physics that these civilizations supposedly didn't possess. The Great Pyramid encodes the speed of light, the circumference of the Earth, and mathematical constants like pi and phi with precision that wasn't officially discovered until the modern era. Coincidence? Maybe, but then you start finding the same impossible knowledge showing up everywhere else. In the Amazon rainforest, satellite imagery reveals the outlines of massive geometric earthworks hidden beneath the canopy. Perfectly circular, square, and octagonal formations covering thousands of acres, built by civilizations that archaeologists insist were primitive hunter-gatherers. The local indigenous peoples have legends about these structures. They say they were built by the people from the water who came from the east, bringing knowledge of mathematics and astronomy before disappearing back into the ocean. In Japan, divers exploring the waters off Yonaguni Island discovered what appears to be a massive stepped pyramid carved from solid rock. The structure shows clear signs of artificial construction, with precise right angles, flat surfaces, and what look like roads and ceremonial platforms. But here's the problem. The structure has been underwater for over 12,000 years, placing its construction at the end of the last ice age, when mainstream archaeology insists no advanced civilizations existed. The Japanese government has classified most research on the site. Official tours are heavily restricted, and when independent researchers try to publish their findings, their papers mysteriously get rejected from academic journals. In the Sahara Desert, ground-penetrating radar has revealed the outlines of massive structures buried beneath the sand. Geometric patterns that span for miles, suggesting cities larger than anything built in the ancient world. But when archaeological teams apply for permits to excavate, they're denied. The official reason is always the same: insufficient funding, political instability, or environmental concerns. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from the ocean itself. Sonar mapping of the ocean floor has revealed structures that shouldn't exist. Massive rectangular formations on the sea floor between Spain and Morocco, exactly where Plato said Atlantis should be. Perfectly straight lines cutting across the Azores plateau. Geometric patterns on the ocean floor near the Bahamas that look suspiciously like the ruins of roads and buildings. Marine archaeologists who've tried to investigate these formations report the same thing. Their research permits get revoked, their funding disappears, or they're reassigned to different projects. One researcher, speaking anonymously, put it this way: "It's as if someone doesn't want us looking too closely at what's down there." But the most chilling evidence isn't archaeological, it's genetic. Recent advances in DNA analysis have revealed something that shouldn't be possible. All around the world, in populations that had no historical contact with each other, researchers are finding identical genetic markers. Not similar markers, identical ones. These markers appear in Native American populations, in Pacific Islanders, in certain Mediterranean groups, and in isolated populations in the Andes Mountains. The markers are ancient, dating back roughly 12,000 years, right around the time Plato said Atlantis was destroyed. It's as if, at some point in the distant past, people carrying this specific genetic signature spread out across the entire globe, interbreeding with local populations and leaving their mark in our DNA. But according to mainstream archaeology, global maritime travel didn't exist 12,000 years ago. The civilizations of that time were supposed to be isolated, primitive, barely surviving the end of the Ice Age, unless they weren't primitive at all. Dr. Maria Santos, a geneticist at a major university who spoke to us on condition of anonymity, put it this way: The data suggests a population bottleneck around 12,000 years ago, followed by rapid global dispersal of specific genetic markers. It's consistent with a maritime civilization that was forced to flee their homeland and scatter across the world. But that's not a conclusion we're allowed to draw officially. When we asked why, her answer was simple: because it would rewrite everything we think we know about human history. And that brings us to the real question. If Atlantis was real, if advanced civilizations existed thousands of years before we thought possible, if knowledge and technology far beyond what we give our ancestors credit for once existed on this planet, then why has this information been suppressed? The answer lies in what that knowledge represents. Think about it. If humanity once possessed technology advanced enough to power entire civilizations, to extend human lifespans, to build structures that still baffle our greatest engineers, then what happened to that knowledge? Where did it go? And more importantly, who controls it now? Because here's what nobody talks about: the same families, the same institutions, the same power structures that control information today have existed for centuries. They've passed knowledge down through generations, carefully guarding certain truths while feeding the masses carefully edited versions of history. The Vatican archives contain millions of documents that have never been made public. The Smithsonian Institution has warehouses full of artifacts that contradict accepted historical timelines. Private collectors and secret societies have hoarded ancient texts and relics for generations, keeping them far from academic scrutiny. What if the real reason Atlantis remains a myth isn't because there's no evidence for it? What if it's because there's too much evidence, and that evidence points to truths that certain people don't want the world to discover? After all, if humanity once achieved a golden age of technology and knowledge, only to lose it all in a single catastrophic event, that raises some uncomfortable questions about our current civilization. Are we as advanced as we think we are? Are we heading toward our own catastrophic fall? And most disturbing of all, are we repeating the same mistakes that destroyed Atlantis? The ancient Egyptian priest who told Solon the story of Atlantis said something that should terrify us all. He said that civilizations rise and fall in cycles, that humanity repeatedly climbs to great heights only to destroy itself through hubris and corruption, forgetting the lessons of the past and having to start over from scratch. What if we're not the first advanced civilization on this planet? What if we're just the latest in a long line of species that thought they had mastered the world, only to discover too late that some knowledge comes with a price too high to pay? The question haunts me as I delve deeper into research that most people will never see, because scattered across the globe, in museums that don't advertise their collections, in private vaults owned by families whose names you'd recognize, there exists a trail of artifacts that tells a story mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge. Take the Antikythera mechanism, for instance. This bronze device, recovered from a Roman shipwreck in 1901, contains gear systems so sophisticated that nothing comparable appears in the historical record until clockmaking reached its peak in the 18th century. But here's what they don't tell you in the documentaries. The shipwreck contained other devices, other mechanisms that were quietly removed from public view. A former museum curator, speaking only on condition of complete anonymity, described seeing bronze instruments with crystalline components, geometric patterns etched with mathematical precision that predates known mathematical discoveries by centuries. These items were catalogued, photographed, and then transferred to secure storage facilities where they remain today, inaccessible to researchers. Why? Because they represent technology that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of ancient capabilities. But it's not just isolated artifacts. It's entire categories of evidence that have been systematically removed from public consciousness. Ancient maps, for instance. The Piri-Reis map of 1513 shows the coastline of Antarctica with impossible accuracy, depicting the continent as it would appear without ice coverage. How could a 16th century cartographer know what Antarctica looked like beneath its ice sheet? The official explanation is that it's a copying error, a misinterpretation of existing maps. But cartography experts who've studied the original document tell a different story. The map contains notations in Ottoman Turkish that reference ancient sources and charts of the Western Sea. Piri Reis himself wrote that he compiled the map from over 20 source documents, some of which he described as being very old and obtained from the people of the sea. People of the sea. The same phrase appears in Egyptian records, in Mesopotamian tablets, in Sanskrit texts from India, always referring to a maritime civilization that possessed advanced navigational knowledge that could travel the oceans with precision impossible for the time period. And here's where it gets disturbing. Every few decades, another one of these impossible maps surfaces, the Orontius Phineus map of 1531, the Mercator map of 1569, the Philippe Boache map of 1754, all showing geographic knowledge that their creators shouldn't have possessed, all referencing ancient sources that no longer exist. Where are those source maps now? Who collected them? And why haven't they been made available for academic study? The answer leads us down a rabbit hole that connects ancient mysteries to modern power structures in ways most people aren't prepared to accept. Consider this. Some of the world's most influential families have been collecting ancient artifacts and documents for centuries. The Rothschild collection, the Vatican's secret archives, the private libraries of European nobility that have never been fully catalogued. These repositories contain knowledge that could revolutionize our understanding of human history, yet they remain locked away from public scrutiny. But occasionally, fragments leak out. A photograph taken by a maintenance worker, a document misplaced during an estate sale, a dying collector who decides to reveal what he spent his lifetime hoarding. In 2019, a cache of documents was discovered in the basement of a demolished building in Venice. The papers, dating back to the 15th century, described expeditions to recover artifacts from the sunken lands beyond the Western Pillars. The documents contained detailed maps of underwater sites, diving techniques that shouldn't have existed in the Renaissance period, and most intriguingly, sketches of objects recovered from the ocean floor that appear to be technological in nature. The documents were purchased by a private collector before historians could study them. They haven't been seen since. This pattern repeats itself across the globe. Archaeological discoveries that don't fit the established timeline disappear into private collections. Researchers who get too close to uncomfortable truths find their careers derailed. Academic papers that challenge accepted history get rejected from journals for insufficient peer review, even when the evidence is overwhelming. It's as if there's an invisible network working to ensure that certain knowledge never reaches the general public. Not because the knowledge is false, but because it's true, and that truth would fundamentally alter how we understand our place in history. But here's what really keeps me awake at night. What if this suppression isn't just about protecting academic reputations or maintaining historical narratives? What if it's about protecting something far more dangerous? The ancient records all agree on one point. Atlantis fell because its people gained access to knowledge they weren't ready to handle responsibly. They developed technology that gave them godlike power, and they used that power to dominate and ultimately destroy themselves. What if that same knowledge still exists? What if fragments of Atlantean science and technology have been preserved, studied, and developed in secret for thousands of years? What if the reason certain truths are kept hidden isn't to protect the past, but to control the future? Think about it. Every major breakthrough in modern technology, from electricity to nuclear power to quantum computing, has military applications that can either elevate humanity or destroy it. What would happen if someone discovered technology that makes our current capabilities look primitive by comparison? The people who control that knowledge would control the world. And perhaps they already do. This brings us to the most unsettling possibility of all. What if the fall of Atlantis wasn't just a historical event? What if it was a template, a pattern that repeats throughout human history whenever a civilization gets too close to truths it's not ready to handle? The more I research, the more I find evidence of other lost civilizations that possessed advanced knowledge and then suddenly vanished. The Anunnaki of Mesopotamia, who taught humans agriculture, metallurgy, and astronomy before mysteriously departing. The Viracocha of South America, who carved impossible stone structures and then disappeared into the mountains. The Nagas of ancient India, who possessed flying machines and weapons that could destroy cities before retreating to underground realms. All of these civilizations left behind the same calling cards: impossible architecture, advanced astronomical knowledge, and legends of technology that sound suspiciously like science fiction. And all of them vanished at the height of their power, leaving only myths and ruins behind. What if these weren't separate civilizations at all? What if they were all part of the same global network? The survivors of Atlantis, who scattered across the world after their homeland was destroyed. What if they spent thousands of years trying to rebuild their lost civilization, only to disappear again whenever they got too close to recovering their dangerous knowledge? And what if that cycle is still continuing today? Consider the similarities between ancient accounts of Atlantean technology and modern scientific developments. The descriptions of crystal-powered energy sources sound remarkably similar to recent breakthroughs in quantum energy manipulation. The accounts of Atlantean longevity treatments echo cutting-edge research into genetic modification and life extension. The stories of communication devices that could reach across vast distances mirror our own development of global telecommunications. Are we rediscovering ancient knowledge, or are we being guided toward it by those who never lost it in the first place? The answer might lie in the bloodlines themselves. Remember those genetic markers I mentioned earlier, the ones that appear in isolated populations around the world? Recent research suggests these markers aren't just evidence of ancient migration. They're evidence of selective breeding programs that have continued for thousands of years. Certain families, certain bloodlines, carry genetic traits that can be traced back to the original Atlantean dispersal. And these same bloodlines have maintained positions of power throughout recorded history, carefully intermarrying to preserve their unique genetic heritage while slowly working to recover their ancestors' lost knowledge. They're not just the descendants of Atlantis. They're its guardians, its inheritors, and perhaps its future restorers. But here's the terrifying part. If the ancient accounts are accurate, if Atlantis really did possess technology capable of extending human life, manipulating matter at the atomic level, and harnessing energy sources we can barely imagine, then the people who control that knowledge today have power beyond anything we can comprehend. They could end poverty, cure disease, solve climate change, and usher in a golden age of human prosperity. Or they could control every aspect of human existence, reducing the rest of us to slaves in a world designed for their benefit alone. The choice isn't ours to make. It never was. Because while we've been arguing about politics and fighting over resources, and debating whether ancient civilizations could have been more advanced than we thought possible, the real power has always remained in the hands of those who knew the truth all along. The question that haunts every serious researcher isn't whether Atlantis existed, it's whether those who inherited its secrets are preparing to use them. Because if you trace the threads carefully, if you follow the money and the power structures and the carefully guarded family trees that stretch back centuries, a chilling picture emerges. The same names appear again and again throughout history, always in positions of influence, always connected to the preservation and study of ancient knowledge, always one step ahead of public discovery. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are documented historical connections that anyone can verify if they know where to look. The problem is, most people don't know where to look because the information has been scattered, compartmentalized, and hidden behind layers of academic bureaucracy and private ownership. But the patterns are there, if you have the patience to find them. Take the Knights Templar, for instance. Everyone knows they were warrior monks who fought in the Crusades. What most people don't know is that they spent decades excavating beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, searching for something specific. When they returned to Europe, they suddenly possessed advanced architectural knowledge, revolutionary banking systems, and engineering capabilities that allowed them to build cathedrals with precision that modern builders still struggle to match. Where did that knowledge come from? The official story is that they learned from local craftsmen and scholars in the Holy Land, but the timing doesn't add up. They acquired centuries' worth of advanced knowledge in just a few decades, knowledge that enabled them to become the most powerful organization in medieval Europe almost overnight. And then, just as suddenly as they had risen, they were destroyed. On Friday the 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the arrest of every Templar in his kingdom. The official charges were heresy and devil worship, but historians now believe the real reason was economic. The Templars had become too wealthy, too powerful, too independent. But here's what's rarely discussed. The Templars saw their destruction coming. Months before the arrests, they began liquidating assets, transferring wealth, and moving their most precious possessions to secure locations. Their vast treasure, accumulated over 2 centuries of operations, simply vanished. Where did it go? Some say it was loaded onto ships and sailed to Scotland, where Robert the Bruce offered them sanctuary. Others believe it was hidden in a network of underground chambers and caves throughout Europe. But what if the truth is simpler and more disturbing? What if the Templars didn't disappear at all? What if they just changed their name? Within decades of the Templar dissolution, new organizations began appearing across Europe. The Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Illuminati, all claiming ancient knowledge, all operating in secret, all connected to the same bloodlines that had controlled the Templars. These weren't separate groups. They were the same organization, evolved and adapted to survive in changing times. And at their core, they all shared the same goal: recovering and protecting the lost knowledge of the ancients while slowly preparing humanity for its return. But preparing us for what exactly? The answer might lie in the prophecies themselves. Because here's something that should terrify anyone who's paying attention. Every ancient civilization that possessed advanced knowledge also left behind warnings about its return. The Maya spoke of cycles of creation and destruction, with each age ending in catastrophe before beginning anew. The Hindus described similar cycles, with humanity rising to great heights before falling into darkness, only to rise again. The Greeks wrote about ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, with each age declining in wisdom and virtue until the gods intervened to start the cycle over. But these weren't just abstract philosophical concepts. They were historical records, disguised as mythology, accounts of real events that repeated throughout time. And according to these ancient chronologies, we're approaching the end of another cycle right now. The signs are everywhere if you know how to read them. Climate change, social upheaval, technological advancement, outpacing human wisdom, growing inequality between those who control knowledge and those who don't. It's the same pattern that preceded the fall of Atlantis, the same hubris and corruption that the ancient texts warned would always lead to destruction. But this time might be different. This time, the inheritors of Atlantean knowledge aren't just watching from the sidelines, they're actively preparing for what comes next. Consider the massive underground construction projects happening around the world. Officially, they're described as military installations, research facilities, or emergency preparedness centers. But the scale of these projects, the resources being invested, the secrecy surrounding their true purpose, suggests something far more significant. Deep underground military bases, seed vaults buried in Arctic permafrost, underground cities capable of housing thousands of people for decades, massive tunnel networks connecting strategic locations across entire continents. all being built with an urgency that suggests their builders know something the rest of us don't. What if they're not just preparing for the next cycle of destruction? What if they're planning to control it? The technology exists. Weather modification systems that can create or prevent storms, seismic weapons that can trigger earthquakes, biological agents that can target specific genetic markers, energy weapons that can disable entire power grids from space. In the wrong hands, these technologies could be used to thin out the global population, eliminate inconvenient political systems, and reshape the world according to the desires of a select few. In the right hands, they could be used to prevent global catastrophe and guide humanity through a transition to a new golden age. The question is, whose hands are they in? So where does this leave us? Standing at the edge of an ocean that holds more secrets than we've ever dared to imagine. The evidence is there, scattered across the globe like pieces of a puzzle that someone desperately wants to keep unsolved. Ancient technologies that shouldn't exist. Genetic markers that tell impossible stories. Underground structures that suggest our ancestors knew something was coming. And maybe they did. Maybe the real lesson of Atlantis isn't that advanced civilizations fall. Maybe it's that they choose when to fall and when to rise again. The next time you look out at the ocean, remember this. Beneath those waves lies the memory of who we once were. And perhaps, if those who guard the ancient secrets decide we're finally ready, the blueprint for who we might become again. The question isn't whether Atlantis existed. The question is whether we're prepared for what happens when it returns.